So hi everyone, thank you so much for the kind introduction, also of Joanna, which I very much appreciate, and also thank you for the invitation. I'm always here, it's like a family reunion, but it's nice to also be invited as a speaker. So what do I do? Okay, so yes, this is joint research with Joanna Kitsnik. She was with me until recently. Now she's moved to Europe, let's say, and we look at the people as possible drivers of Japan's green transformation. So we specifically look at dynamics and pro-environmental attitudes and behavior over the past 3 decades. So what actually happened there? That's what we're interested in. So, I mean, we already heard Japan has declared to become carbon neutral in 2050. No worries, I'm not going to go into this now. We also know probably what they're doing right now is not going to be enough. And yesterday we also heard, Franz also had this in his slides, looking in international comparison. This is the Climate Change Performance Index. Japan's not really doing so very well. This is only the G20, so yeah, what's going on there? And our question is, what is the role of the population in how Japan reacts to the climate crisis? Here, Barbara also had this yesterday in her presentation. SDGs are everywhere. You cannot escape them if you live in Japan, but is it just a fashion statement? And I seriously believe yes, probably yes, for a lot of people. Or is there an actual deeper understanding and also concern? Specifically, I'm thinking about environmental sustainability. So what about the urgency of this topic? How is it perceived when we look at international comparisons? People very much in Japan still think more about economic growth. This is what we should be focusing on, rather than we should think about the environment. That's very clear. We also have seen, Axel mentioned this yesterday, climate change mitigation measures are not part of political campaigns at all. We just had the national election. I did not hear anybody mention it ever, so do the citizens not care? Because if they did, this would be part of the political agenda, right? So what happens then if they don't care, right? Once stricter measures must be introduced, are they going to comply? What will happen? So we heard this morning about the possible shifts or different paths that could happen. I'm not going to go into this now, otherwise I won't be able to show my data. So why do we think individual level attitudes matter? You could say, well, it doesn't matter if you use a plastic straw or not, because we need big systemic changes, etc. But of course, it still matters. And we think it matters because environmental action occurs at institutional, governmental, but also at individual levels. Of course, the collective impacts of our choices of consumption, transportation, or energy consumption, or other consumption patterns, they all collectively affect the environment, but specifically also the policy impact. So environmental policies rely on public compliance, support on people in a democracy. Supposedly, Japan is one. Nobody's ever so sure if that's really true, but so if the people are interested in this, then this should have an impact, right? But also equity and social justice. So different demographic groups differ in exposure to climate change, but also in their capacity to respond. And this may also result in disparities in how climate change mitigation measures are perceived and supported by different groups in the population, and not just on an international level, but also within a society, right? So we think that individual level attitudes is essential, so understanding them is essential in order to achieve a meaningful change. So then thinking a step further, a little bit background, so what are determinants of pro-environmental behavior? What makes people act towards the environment? And here we already heard about the attitude-behavior gap, at least mentioned this morning also. So first of all, of course, attitudes do not translate one-to-one into behavioral outcomes, but they are decisive for actions. And so research has shown environmental attitudes are central predictors of ecological behaviors. But also people's behavioral intention. So you can have an attitude, but does that then make you also want to act upon it, let's say? As well as the belief that the actions can have an impact. So self-efficacy is also part of this. However, yes, so attitudes do not come into being in a vacuum, but they are also set within a specific context. And so sociodemographic characteristics of people probably also play into what type of attitudes they may hold. So we know from other societies, young people, women, people with higher education and income tend to have more climate-friendly views. but also degree of societal engagement, experiences of climate change impact, these all can impact as well. And we try to look at all of this, how does that play out in the context of Japan, because there is not really much research on this at all. So then one aspect of our analysis is looking at changes over time, and so we have some hypotheses of before starting digging into the data, what could be expected. Well, one hypothesis would be that the broadening base hypothesis, so as environmental hazards become more tangible, climate change becomes a prominent topic in the media, environmental concerns should diffuse throughout the population. SDGs trains everywhere, so this should have happened in Japan. So this should result in a broader base of support for environmental protection. And then a kind of countering hypothesis would be the economic contingency hypothesis. So economically vulnerable people are less likely to support environmental protection, especially during poor economic conditions. They have other stuff to think about, so there's a trade-off. And for Japan over the past 3 decades, this should have resulted in significant differences by socioeconomic status, right? Also, we consider the technological optimism hypothesis. It's kind of a side project, if you will. So individuals who believe in the power of technology to solve problems may be less likely to feel the need to change their own behavior, because technology is going to take care of it, right? So they may believe that technological advancements will solve the problem of climate change without requiring any individual behavioral changes. Okay, so this leads to our research questions. First of all, changes over time from 1993 to 2020, which is the data we have. So how have environmental attitudes and actual pro-environmental behavior changed in Japan? And does this differ between different sociodemographic groups? And then also a bit kind of focusing on 2020, what are the core predictors of environmental behavior in 2020? The data that we're using, and here, if you want to, you can have a look at the descriptives for these different data sets that we're using. So relying on data from the ISSP, there is an environment module that they carry out every about 10 years. And for Japan, there is data for 1993, 2000, 2010, and 2020. So we worked with that available data. Our analytical strategy, we look at changes over time using year fixed effects models, predicting attitudes, the willingness to make sacrifices. I'll introduce the variables in a second, self-efficacy and behavior. And then for 2020, we use regressions with some additional explanatory variables. The QR code still stays on the next slide in case, so no, but I'll come back to it. It'll appear again. I have to look at time. So environmental attitudes, what do we have that we can work with for all these time points? Not the greatest variables, but people were asked about to rate these statements. So we worry too much about the environment, not enough about prices and jobs today, and we coded it so that if you disagree with that, that means you kind of have a pro-environmental attitude. Similar, people worry too much about human progress harming the environment. Then self-efficacy, it's just too difficult for someone like me to do something about the environment. Okay, sorry, pressed the wrong button, but it still worked out. Then willingness, in order to protect the environment, how willing would you be to pay much higher prices, much higher taxes, and to accept cuts in your standard of living? And then believe in technological solutions to climate change is, modern science will solve our environmental problems with little change to our way of life. And we coded it here so that higher values actually mean you're not believing in this. So just keep this in mind for interpreting the data that I will be showing. Then for environmental behavior, we first had thought we make one big index, and then we realized these are completely different types of behavior, so we divided it up into low-cost behavior, which is how often do you recycle, and in Japan, you cannot really escape it, so it's pretty much everybody does it, so we realized it's not really, doesn't have much explanatory power, so that's low cost. Some cost, I do what is right for the environment, even when it costs more money or it takes more time. And then high cost is, are you a member of any group whose main aim it is to preserve or protect the environment? So you really have to be quite invested in these topics to do that. In the last 5 years, have you signed a petition about an environmental issue, given money to an environmental group, taken part in a protest or demonstration about an environmental issue? Then, more variables. Sociodemographics, what do we include? So we, of course, look at gender, age. We compare between different age groups. Then education, marital status. Here, they only ask whether there are children under the age of 18 years in the household, so we have to work with what's there. Household income before tax, we kept really detailed groups in order to not miss any effects. And then we also looked at whether there's a difference between urban and rural areas. And then for 2020, we have some additional variables: subjective social status, then the experience of extreme weather events, and political participation in terms of voted or not in the last election. Okay, now let's first look at changes in attitudes over time. So here I'm going through one by one. Here you see how they developed over time. They are all normalized so that you can compare it from 0 to 1. And we control for gender, age, education, urban, rural, so that, for example, it's an aging society. If you don't do that, then you kind of distort the result. So environmental attitudes increased a little bit. It is a significant difference, but it's not a huge increase, but there is some increase. Specifically here, higher educational level throughout of all years have stronger environmental attitudes. Then for environmental self-efficacy, slightly decreased. And again, here also higher educational level means slightly higher self-efficacy, but over time we see a decrease in this. So do you think you can have an impact, right, with your own behavior? Willingness to make sacrifices decreased, and that's a pretty big decrease there. And we see here again, okay, education has an impact. With people with higher education throughout display higher willingness to make sacrifices. In rural areas, we find lower willingness to make sacrifices. I mean, it's, I think, always a trade-off. How much do you have that you can reduce from, right, in terms of standard of living? And the biggest chunk of why this drops is a difference in, like a shift in how different age groups think about this. And we see younger age groups becoming very much less willing to do this. And lastly, believe in technological solutions to climate change. There's no clear trend. Younger age groups used to display somewhat stronger belief in it, but that effect kind of disappears, so I don't have a good interpretation here. Now, what about behaviors? So let's look at low-cost behavior, recycling at the top left. So overall, super high, you can already see it, and slight increase overall. Recycling is available pretty much everywhere, and it's kind of, if you don't do it, it's gonna be tough to remain living in your neighborhood because people will diss you about it, so it's not so voluntary maybe. And there are still differences. Younger age groups, unmarried and men are slightly less likely to recycle. Then some cost behavior. This is more interesting. I think, so act ecologically, even if it costs a little more time or money, decreased over time. And here also, from 2010, it's specifically the younger age groups who are less willing to do this. This is completely counter to what we find for Germany, for example. Exact opposite. And an income effect here, so this, you could say it's about money, but it doesn't seem to be. Something else is at work there. So no clear income effect here. Then high cost behavior, so political activism, it's not a surprise. It's overall low to start with. Everybody here is familiar with the context of Japan. I don't have to explain this, but people don't really go out so much and demonstrate in the street, etc. But it even decreased over time. It's overall low, but even decreased, and we do not find significant differences by demographics at all. So it's really quite striking results. Now, let me go further into determinants of environmental behavior in 2020, just to look a little bit deeper into what makes people act or not act. So here we have some additional measures. So first of all, we use a different dependent variable for the behavior because they introduced this one in 2020. So we called it eco-friendly consumption. So how often do you avoid buying? So this is not really about consumption, but avoidance. So we might want to call it something else. So how often do you avoid buying a certain product for environmental reasons, right? And then we also exchanged what we used to measure the attitude because they added environmental concern, which is a better variable to measure this. So how concerned are you about environmental issues? Okay, method for this, regression models that predict what predicts eco-friendly consumption in 2020. And these are long models. We have a lot of variables, so I left out the ones that we did not find a direct effect for, but they are important to know about, because no clear effect for gender, education on this avoidance of consumption, let's say, for environmental reasons. Income, super important. We do not find it in Germany, for example. There is an effect of this. Having children and also living in a rural versus urban area. So these are all included in the models that I will show you, but they did not have a significant effect on this dependent variable. Now, I know this is small, and I'm just going to sum up what's important to understand. So first model, we just include the sociodemographics, and explained variance is not low for this, and the main effect really comes from age here. So comparing these age groups, so our reference group here is the 65 plus group, and that group is most likely to make these eco-friendly consumption choices, so not buying something for environmental reasons, and the 30 to 44-year-olds least likely, but also the youngest group also less likely. Okay, I will move on. Then we, also eco-friendly choice is more likely for people who are married and have a higher subjective social status. And just that question might come, the subjective social status does not cover up an income effect. I think some people might suspect it not happening, so we checked this all. Okay, then moving to the next model where we just added extreme weather impact. So the explained variance doesn't go up so much, but there is an effect. So a tangible experience of extreme weather events increases the likelihood of eco-friendly behavior. Adding political engagement. So people who vote are more likely to act in favor of the environment. And then we just threw in the whole big chunk of these attitudes, and the explained variance jumps up, which is not a surprise, right? But we have a strong positive impact of the willingness to make sacrifices. Also, of course, also the environmental concern, which is kind of the attitude that comes first, if you will. Then comes the willingness. Then comes plus environmental self-efficacy. So these are all important. And specifically, the effect of willingness is very strong. Here, and you can't see this here, but there is an indirect effect of education on this. So education has an effect on these attitudes, so we probably see something happening here, something we want to go into further. And then also the belief in a technological solution to climate change actually means less likelihood of eco-friendly consumption or avoiding to buy something. So this is also something we find. So let me sum up. First of all, changes over time. So pro-environmental attitudes slightly increased, so they did increase, but the willingness to make sacrifices and environmental self-efficacy decreased, and they are really important for making people act, right? So this goes down. Pro-environmental behavior decreased, except for the recycling, okay. Then overall, only small differences across sociodemographic groups, which is also, you know, when you do not find an effect, it's kind of boring, but it's also important to understand that this is not there, right? Then, so for the broadening base hypothesis, it's slightly supported only for the pro-environmental attitudes, but not in terms of taking an action. Then economic contingency hypothesis is not supported. Wrong direction. Then for predictors of eco-friendly behavior in 2020, or of this consumption avoidance for the environment, I should say. So explanatory power here also of economic status is weak. Education seems to have an indirect effect, but age is the big, really interesting big factor in this whole thing. So the highest concern and most likely to avoid buying something for environmental reasons is the 65 plus group, and the younger age groups show lower concern, lower willingness, lower self-efficacy, and lower eco-friendly behavior. Political engagement seems to be very interesting, so an interest in societal matters seems decisive. An experience of extreme weather events also increases this. And then these internal factors seem to be key factors, but I mean, where do they come from, right? That's really not something we know yet. Then for technological optimism hypothesis, that's supported. Respondents with stronger belief in technological solutions to climate change were less likely to display pro-environmental behavior. I'm nearly done. I know I have to look at time. Conclusion, So what does that then mean for Japan's green shift? Are the people the driver? No, clearly not. So that's the short answer, no. So our data, however, seem to show, and I think that is important and interesting to understand or know, so there seem to be no major fault lines except maybe age, but I'm not really sure. So at least not by social class about climate change mitigation in the population. So it's not like lower income groups are scared and therefore might not support it. Doesn't seem to be happening here. Overall, this is not a politicized, a polarizing topic in Japan. The polarization is not happening. It's something that we can show here. You can say, okay, it's maybe good in the short run for the government. Nobody complains about what they're doing. So the current soft strategies of just nudging and giving incentives, nobody complains about it, if you will, at least no strong voices there. But are these changes enough? And may this not backfire in the long run? And there, our data show that people increasingly perceive the necessity to protect the environment. Okay, but they are less willing to make sacrifices and feel also less likely that their own actions can have an impact. So especially younger age groups. I wonder, however, what they think about, probably like, oh, my plastic straw is not going to save the world, and nobody considers that, oh, I could have a political voice that may be important. Maybe that's also not something people consider when they respond to these questions, right? So what happens then when the population detaches themselves from the responsibility of acting against climate change? And that actually, I think, relates also to what the previous presenter, Hikaru, what he showed about this idea of kind of small happiness in your own like reduction and be happy with what you have. But I think it's also kind of disengaging with societal topics. I think that is what we're seeing with this. I don't think there's a shift in happiness, but I think people just kind of are happy and comfortable with what they have, and everything else, I don't care. So that's more my gist of it, but I'm happy to talk about that in the discussion. And so are people likely to comply once mitigation measures, they must become more severe, right? And they will directly impact daily lives and livelihoods. So what will happen then, right? That will be, let's say, interesting to observe. Just at the very end, so next steps for the project. This is really something I just started. And there's so much stuff that we can't measure with the data available. It's not our own survey, so we really want to look more, have more specific questions about the impact of climate change and who do people rely on to take care of problems, or are they even interested? Like, who is disinterested? That will be super hard to ask and find out because of social desirability. Climate anxiety is another point I want to work on for Japan, but also socioeconomic anxieties and the trade-off between, because I think people are super scared of losing what they have, and that makes them push away any environmental topics. They're not really important right now. And I will carry out, or we will carry out a large survey next year together with qualitative interviews with a grant from Sophia. And this brings me to the end. Thank you very much for your attention. And I still have a few copies of the book with me, Sustainable Societies in a Fragile World, and actually it includes a comparison of Germany and Japan with this data. In case somebody's interested, I'm happy to hand out a few free copies that I brought with me. So thank you very much for this.